Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is Mr. Midnight Lullabies. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, but before you drift off, I'd like for you to leave a comment, letting me know where in the world you are listening from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's cases. Story 1. Branford, Connecticut. A town of quiet neighborhoods and narrow streets, lined with oak trees. A place where families settle in search of safety, familiarity, and routine. It is the kind of town where people still wave to their neighbors, where you notice when someone doesn't take their trash out, where nothing feels distant. But on the morning of May 1st, 2025, that familiarity was pierced. At 6:35 a.m., a 911 call came in. A woman's voice. Concerned. Something was wrong at a house on Cherry Hill Road. The call didn't say much, but it was enough to send police to the address. When they arrived, they found a home quiet from the outside. The front door was shut. The lawn hadn't been touched. The lights inside were still on. But in the basement of that home, a 12-year-old boy lay motionless. His name was Anthony P. Esposito. He had suffered blunt force injuries to his head. His body was found near a bloodied baseball bat. Upstairs, his 16-year-old sister had escaped through a window and run for help. Police say she was the one who led them to the truth. Her father, Anthony Andrew Esposito Jr., was gone. He had left the house shortly after, and within hours, he was stopped and arrested in a traffic stop. He said little. He offered no resistance. And in those few short hours, a family was destroyed. A boy was gone. A teenager had witnessed what no child should ever have to see. And the man at the center of it all was in handcuffs. This was not an accident. It was not a case of mistaken identity. There were no strangers in the home that night. It was a father, his son, and his daughter. For those who knew the family, what happened was not easy to understand. To them, Anthony Jr. was a father of two, known in the community, not known for violence, not known for threats. A man who, on the surface, had always been part of his children's lives. But now, he was charged with murder with special circumstances, one of the most serious charges under Connecticut law, an attempted murder for what police believe he tried to do to his daughter. As investigators began piecing together what had happened inside that house, more questions emerged. Anthony Jr. told police that he heard voices, that he believed things that weren't real. That trauma from his own childhood had returned, and that he wasn't in control. Mental illness, abuse, delusion, none of it would bring his son back. In Branford, the news spread quickly. Shock turned to grief, and grief, in many ways, turned to confusion. How could this have happened? Was it preventable? Did anyone see it coming? A candlelight vigil was held outside St. Mary Church. Hundreds of people gathered. Some brought flowers. Some brought candles. Some didn't say a word. They just stood there, holding one another in silence. This story is not about headlines. It is not about sensationalism. It is about a child whose life was taken before he had the chance to live it. It is about a teenage girl who may carry these memories for the rest of her life. It is about a man whose actions may never be fully explained, even by him. This is a story about what was lost and what remains. In the next hour, we will walk the life of a family that no longer exists the way it once did. We will examine the details of the case, the questions that still don't have answers, and the impact left behind in a small Connecticut town. This is the case of Anthony Andrew Esposito Jr., and this is the story of what happened on May 1st, 2025. To understand how a home became a crime scene, we have to look back, not just at what happened, but at who these people were before it all fell apart. The Esposito family lived in a modest home on Cherry Hill Road in Branford, Connecticut, a 3-bedroom house with a basement. Nothing extravagant, nothing unusual. It was the kind of place where bikes were kept in the driveway, where school books were left on the kitchen table, and where the calendar still had old reminders scrawled across the days. Anthony Andrew Esposito Jr. was a father. He was 48 years old. He had custody of both of his children. The boy, 12 years old, was named after him, Anthony P. Esposito. His daughter was 16. People who knew the family described them as quiet. There were no loud arguments, no frequent visits from police, no outward signs of chaos. But quiet doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it just means no one's asking questions. Anthony Jr. had struggled with his mental health for years. This didn't come out publicly until after his arrest, but it had been there. According to court records and statements later provided to investigators, he had described hearing voices. He had mentioned trauma from his past. He claimed he had been abused when he was a child. And over time, he began to believe his children were being harmed in the same way. There was no evidence that they were. But for Anthony Jr., the belief was real. And sometimes, belief is all it takes to bend reality, especially when no one is watching closely enough to intervene. He was not working full-time at the time of the incident. Neighbors said they would see him come and go at odd hours. He didn't speak to many people, but his children, they were always with him. The boy, Anthony P., was described as polite, reserved but kind. He played outside. He went to Walsh Intermediate School, just a few minutes away. His teachers later said he was soft-spoken. He wasn't a child who drew attention to himself, but he was always present, always doing what was asked of him. His sister, older by 4 years, was more private. She kept to herself, but she was close with her brother. The two were seen walking to school together, running errands with their father. At a glance, they looked like any other family. There is no record of recent involvement from the Department of Children and Families. No prior arrest for Anthony Jr., no restraining orders, no psychiatric holds. Nothing that would have signaled to the system that something was wrong. But something was. Family members later said they had concerns. One relative, who would eventually create a fundraising page for funeral expenses, said the children's mother was not in the picture. She had struggled herself. The father had full custody, and for a long time, they said, he seemed capable of managing it. Then came the subtle changes. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations declined. The children weren't seen outside as often. There were fewer photos, fewer conversations, less visibility. But even then, no one thought it would come to this. There were no signs of physical abuse, no school reports indicating fear, no paper trail, just the absence of clarity, and the growing sense that something in that house wasn't right. By the time anyone knew for certain, it was too late. Anthony Jr. had become isolated. Whatever was going on in his mind, it stayed there, contained, out of reach, and his children, his son and daughter, remained under his care in the home where everything would eventually unravel. This was a family, a father, a son, and a daughter, on paper, intact. But paper doesn't show everything. What happened next, on the morning of May 1st, would leave that home broken, its doors forever marked by what was found inside. May 1st, 2025. By the time the sun began to rise over Branford, the events that would change the course of several lives had already taken place. At 6:35 a.m., a call was placed to 911. It came from a woman who had spoken with Anthony Esposito, Jr. earlier that morning. According to Branford police, she expressed concern about his state of mind. She asked for a welfare check. Her message wasn't specific, but it was enough. Officers were dispatched to Cherry Hill Road. When they arrived, the front of the house gave no immediate indication of what they were walking into. There were no broken windows, no signs of forced entry, nothing outwardly alarming. But when they entered the home, they quickly realized this was not a routine check. A teenage girl, 16 years old, approached them. She was distressed. She had escaped through a second-floor window and run to get help. She told officers her father had attacked them, that her younger brother was in the basement, that he wasn't breathing. Police moved quickly. In the basement, they found the body of 12-year-old Anthony P. Esposito. He had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. Next to him was a baseball bat, bloodied. The room was in disarray, but there was no sign of a struggle that extended beyond that space. The boy was pronounced dead at the scene. His sister, though physically unharmed, was visibly shaken. She was able to give police critical information in the moments that followed. According to her, Their father had acted strangely that morning. Something about him had shifted. Then, without warning, he turned violent. She escaped. Her brother didn't. The father, Anthony Jr., was gone. He had left the house shortly before police arrived. The teenager told officers what kind of car he drove and where he might be headed. By 7:45 a.m., about an hour after the 911 call, Branford police located his vehicle during a traffic stop on East Main Street. He was taken into custody without resistance. No weapon was found on him. He offered no explanation for what had happened, at least not right away. Back at the house, investigators began processing the scene. The basement was treated as the primary location of the assault. The bat was collected as evidence. The home was sealed. Crime scene technicians worked for hours, carefully documenting everything, from blood spatter to fingerprints to the path each person took that morning. That same afternoon, the Branford Police Department held a press conference. Chief John Alves confirmed the victim's age. He acknowledged the tragedy. He offered limited details, citing the early stage of the investigation. But he said this: "It's difficult for our officers, and it's difficult for community." Anthony Jr. was charged later that day with murder with special circumstances, a designation used when a victim is under the age of 16. He was also charged with attempted murder for what police say he tried to do to his daughter. His bond was set at $5 million. During questioning, he told detectives that he believed his children were being abused, that he was trying to protect them, that he had been abused in his own childhood, and he feared history was repeating itself. He said he heard voices. There was no evidence supporting his claims about his children. Investigators found no third-party involvement, no indication that anyone else had harmed them. What they found instead was a man who had acted alone, and 2 children caught in the center of it. Within 12 hours, the story had spread through local media. By evening, residents in Branford began leaving flowers outside the home. Some stopped by the school the boy attended, where grief counselors had already been called in. No one expected it, but it had happened, and now the process of understanding or trying to had begun. After his arrest on the morning of May 1st, Anthony Andrew Esposito Jr. was taken to the Branford Police Department for processing. He remained calm. Officers noted that he did not appear under the influence of drugs or alcohol. His demeanor was quiet. Some described it as detached. That same day, he was transferred to the custody of the New Haven Judicial District. Prosecutors moved swiftly. He was formally charged with murder with special circumstances, as defined under Connecticut General Statute Section 53A 54B. This charge applies when the victim is under the age of 16 and carries the possibility of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In addition, he faced a second charge, attempted murder, based on statements made by his daughter and evidence collected at the scene. Police allege that he intended to kill both children. Only one survived. These are among the most serious charges a state can bring. At his first court appearance, held via video conference from the correctional facility, Esposito stood motionless in a beige prison uniform. His face was blank. He did not speak, except to confirm his name. The judge set bond at $5 million and ordered that if released, he would be subject to GPS monitoring and house arrest. But there was no indication he would be able to post bail. The public defender appointed to his case requested a psychiatric evaluation almost immediately. Court documents show that Anthony Jr. claimed to be hearing voices. He said he had experienced severe abuse as a child. He believed his children were being harmed in the same way. But when asked for details, he could not provide any. The prosecution did not dispute that Esposito had a history of mental health struggles, but they emphasized that there was no evidence of current abuse involving his children. No reports had been filed. No complaints had been made. His fears, they argued, were not grounded in reality. The defense, meanwhile, began preparing for what would likely be a competency hearing. Their position was clear. They intended to argue that Anthony Jr. was not mentally fit to stand trial, that he could not meaningfully understand the charges against him or participate in his own defense. This opened the door to a possible insanity defense, a rare and complex legal path that would require extensive psychiatric evaluation and expert testimony. Under Connecticut law, The bar for such a defense is high. The defendant must prove not only that they had a mental disease or defect at the time of the crime, but also that it rendered them unable to appreciate the nature or wrongfulness of their conduct. In the weeks that followed his arrest, Esposito remained held at the Wally Avenue Correctional Center, awaiting further evaluation. The case drew attention across the state, not just because of its brutality, but because of its unanswered questions. Why now? Why his children? Why no warning? Court filings offered some insight. In a sworn affidavit, officers described the condition of the home. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of drug use, no alcohol bottles. Just a blood-stained bat, a boy's body, and a statement from a teenage girl who had escaped something she could barely explain. Prosecutors have made it clear they intend to pursue the maximum penalty under the law. But the case may take years to reach trial, especially if mental competency remains in dispute. Family members of the victims, those who spoke to the media, have expressed frustration. One relative posted publicly, saying, "There were no signs, no warning, just heartbreak." Others have remained silent, their grief too raw, their memories too close. As of now, Esposito has not entered a formal plea. The court awaits the results of his psychiatric evaluation. The prosecution is gathering expert witnesses, and the state is preparing for what may become a lengthy, high-stakes trial. But for the boy who was lost and the girl who survived, the courtroom will offer no restoration, only judgment. This is the legal process. It is slow, it is deliberate, and it has only just begun. The events of May 1st didn't just end with an arrest. They left behind something far heavier, a wound that would settle deep into the fabric of a community that wasn't prepared for loss on this scale. In the hours following the news of the homicide, word spread through Branford like a slow wave. First whispers, then text messages, then confirmation. A boy, just 12 years old, was dead, and not by accident, not by misadventure, but by violence. In his own home, parents clutched their children a little tighter. At Walsh Intermediate School, where Anthony P. Esposito had been a student, classes went quiet. Some teachers couldn't bring themselves to speak. Others tried carefully to explain the unexplainable. Grief counselors were brought in that same morning. The school principal issued a statement by afternoon, acknowledging the death of a student and offering support to those affected. No names were officially mentioned at first, but the students knew. They had sat beside him. He had walked the same halls they did. And now he was gone. Outside the school, flowers began to appear. At first, just a few. By the end of the week, dozens. Messages written in children's handwriting. "We miss you, Anthony. You were a good friend." In town, a vigil was planned. It took place outside St. Mary Church just 2 days after the incident. Families gathered at dusk. Some held candles. Some prayed. Others stood in silence. The church bells rang 12 times, once for each year of the boy's life. There were no speeches, just moments. The teenage girl, his sister, was not in attendance. She was staying with relatives. She had not returned to school. Authorities said she was receiving trauma counseling. She had witnessed something that would take a lifetime to process. And at just 16 years old, she was suddenly without her brother and without her father. Family members released limited public statements. One relative created a verified GoFundMe to assist with funeral costs and care for the surviving daughter. It described the children as beautiful, kind-hearted souls and referred to what happened as unthinkable. The goal was modest. The response was not. Hundreds of people donated. Many left messages not just of sympathy, but of disbelief. The words most often repeated were, "no signs." No one saw it coming. No one could explain how a family could appear intact on Tuesday and be shattered by Wednesday. In the weeks that followed, neighbors struggled to reconcile the quiet man they had occasionally seen outside with the headlines that now bore his name. Some admitted they didn't know him at all. Others said they had seen signs of stress, long stares, odd routines, but nothing alarming enough to report. The house on Cherry Hill Road was left vacant. Police tape had long since come down, but the silence around the property remained. There were no cars in the driveway, no lights on, just a mailbox still bearing the family's name. For a time, the media attention faded. Reporters moved on. But for Branford, the wound stayed open. Children asked their parents difficult questions. Parents searched for answers that didn't exist. And somewhere, a teenage girl tried to find a way forward. Her story is one the public may never fully hear. Her privacy has been respected by authorities and by the court, but her loss, the weight of what she witnessed, remains one of the quietest and most haunting elements of this case. This was not just the loss of a child. It was the unraveling of a family, and in a town that once believed it could never happen here. That belief no longer holds. In the days following Anthony Esposito Jr.'s arrest, the conversation around the case shifted, not away from grief that remained, but toward understanding, or at least attempting to. Why would a father, with no known criminal history, no report of abuse, and full custody of 2 children, suddenly commit an act so violent it left one child dead and another deeply traumatized? According to statements given to police and later disclosed in court filings, Anthony Jr. believed his children were being harmed, not by strangers, not by people in the community, but by someone or something he could not clearly identify. When pressed, he mentioned vague memories from his own childhood. Abuse, he said, repressed trauma. And then he made a leap that because he had suffered, his children must be suffering too. There was no evidence of this. None. But he said he felt it. He heard voices. He saw signs. He claimed he was trying to protect them. This is a language of psychosis, of delusional thinking. But in the legal system, there's a difference between having a mental illness and being unable to distinguish right from wrong. To establish an insanity defense in Connecticut, the burden is on the defense. They must prove that at the time of the crime, the defendant had a mental disease or defect so severe that he either didn't understand what he was doing or didn't know it was wrong. Mental illness alone does not qualify. And in most cases, even when it is present, it is not enough. At his initial hearing, Esposito's court-appointed attorney asked for a psychiatric evaluation, not just for treatment, but to determine competency, whether he could understand the charges and assist in his defense. The request was granted. Competency evaluations in Connecticut are conducted by the Division of Forensic Services, often involving multiple interviews, psychological testing, and a review of past medical records, if they exist. In Esposito's case, very little was known about his psychiatric history prior to May 1st. There were no hospitalizations on public record, no diagnoses listed in family court, no mandatory treatments ordered by the state. This raises questions. Was he silently struggling for years? Was he untreated? Or did something new emerge, a late-onset psychotic break, triggered by stress, isolation, or unresolved trauma? Experts say it's possible. Late-onset psychosis can occur, particularly in individuals with a history of trauma. And when it manifests, the person experiencing it often doesn't see it as illness. To them, the delusions are real. The danger is real. The decision to act, though irrational to outsiders, can feel like a form of rescue. But this belief, however sincere, doesn't automatically remove responsibility. At the crime scene, Esposito did not attempt to conceal what he had done. He did not flee the state. He left the house, but only briefly, and was taken into custody without incident. He spoke to police. He described the attack, and he expressed no remorse, only fear. When asked why he did it, one officer recalled his words, "I thought I had to." It is a sentence, short, simple, and devastating, that sits at the center of the legal and moral debate. Was it madness? Or was it a choice shaped by madness, but still a choice? Psychiatrists may offer opinions. Courts may draw conclusions. But full understanding may never come. Mental illness is not a justification, but it is a factor. And when a child is lost, the public demands accountability. But it also wants to know why. In this case, the answers may not arrive in one clear statement. They may only emerge piece by piece, through interviews, reports, and testimony that the public may never fully hear. And for the daughter, the one who survived, her father's mind is now part of her story, too. Not just what he did, but what he believed, and how far he let that belief go. Every time a tragedy like this occurs, the same questions rise to surface. Could it have been prevented? Were there warning signs? Did someone miss them? In the case of Anthony Esposito Jr., there were no emergency calls, no active investigations, no red flags documented by Child Protective Services, at least not publicly. But that doesn't mean there weren't signals, subtle ones, private ones, that something was off. Mental health professionals often point out that the path to violent breakdown is rarely sudden. It tends to unfold gradually, across weeks, months, sometimes years. What can feel like a single, explosive act often sits at the end of a long, invisible road. So why wasn't help available? Why didn't he reach for it? The answer lies in how mental health care is structured in the United States. Reactive, fragmented, and often inaccessible unless a person poses an immediate threat. In many states, including Connecticut, the threshold for involuntary intervention is high. An adult must be deemed a danger to themselves or others, and even then, the process can be bureaucratic and slow. That model assumes people will seek treatment voluntarily. But what happens when a person doesn't believe they're sick? When they think their thoughts are correct and everyone else is wrong? This is one of the most dangerous aspects of untreated psychosis, a condition that often strips away insight. The person doesn't know they're unwell. To them, the hallucinations, the paranoia, the fear, it all feels real. This is where systems often fail, because there is no standard protocol for subtle concern. There's no number to call when someone seems off but hasn't done anything wrong. And too often, people don't know what to look for until it's too late. There are also questions about custody. Anthony Jr. had full legal custody of both children. That doesn't happen by accident. Family courts typically assess parental fitness during custody disputes. So what was seen then? Did his mental state deteriorate after the arrangement was made? Or was it missed? Records related to those proceedings remain sealed, as they often are in family court. But what's clear now is this. The system placed both children in his care, and one of them didn't survive. Experts say the issue isn't just about this one case. It's systemic. It's about the lack of early intervention, the stigma that keeps people from speaking up, and the chronic underfunding of mental health programs, especially those aimed at prevention rather than crisis response. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, nearly 1 in 5 U.S. adults experience mental illness each year, but only about half receive treatment. And when it comes to psychotic disorders, schizophrenia, delusional disorder, and related conditions, the gap is even wider. People often go undiagnosed for years. In many states, there's also a shortage of forensic psychologists, professionals who can assess mental competency, risk, and criminal responsibility. That shortage leads to delays, backlogs, and sometimes missed chances to intervene. What happened in Branford is extreme, but it's not isolated. Across the country, other families have faced similar losses. Children harmed or killed by parents in the grip of untreated psychosis. Each time, the headlines say the same thing. There were no signs. But what they often mean is, there were no signs we were trained to see. The goal of this conversation is not to excuse violence. It is to understand the conditions that allow it to take root. Because without that understanding, the cycle repeats. Mental illness becomes shame instead of signal. Families stay silent. Systems stay overwhelmed. And people fall through the cracks. Anthony Jr. didn't ask for help. But did anyone ask him if he needed it? That question lingers. And for the family he leaves behind, for the daughter still trying to rebuild her life, it may never have a satisfying answer. But it's a question that systems, lawmakers, and communities must begin to take seriously, not just in memory of one boy, but in protection of others. As of today, the case against Anthony Andrew Esposito Jr. remains in its early stages. The investigation is ongoing, and while some aspects of the case are already clear, others are still being pieced together, particularly when it comes to understanding the full scope of his mental state leading up to the murder. Esposito is currently being held without bond, as the prosecution has made it clear they intend to seek the maximum sentence. In Connecticut, that could mean life in prison without the possibility of parole, especially given the special circumstances of the crime, the death of a minor at the hands of a parent. His legal team, meanwhile, is focused on evaluating his mental competency. They have requested multiple psychiatric evaluations, not only to assess his fitness to stand trial, but also to determine whether an insanity defense might be viable. The defense team has suggested that his actions, though extreme, were driven by a psychotic break, and that he may have been unable to fully comprehend the consequences of his actions at the time of the murder. In the coming months, the court will likely schedule competency hearings. These hearings will allow expert witnesses, psychologists, psychiatrists, and legal professionals to present their findings. Esposito's defense could present evidence of a long-standing mental health issue, one that was perhaps ignored or undiagnosed until it reached a breaking point. The prosecution, however, will argue that his actions were deliberate, that he knew what he was doing, and that the tragedy was a consequence of choice, not illness. The outcome of these hearings will be pivotal in shaping the rest of the case. If Esposito is declared mentally competent, he will proceed to trial, where a jury will ultimately decide whether he is guilty of murder and whether he should face the harshest penalties under Connecticut law. If he is declared incompetent, the case could be delayed further, as the court would likely require that he undergo treatment before he is fit to stand trial. In that case, the court may also consider placing him in a psychiatric institution, where he could remain until he is deemed well enough to face the charges. But even if Esposito does eventually face trial, there are broader questions that will linger, questions that won't be answered by any verdict or sentence. How can we, as a society, better detect the warning signs of severe mental illness before it erupts into violence? How can systems be restructured to intervene earlier, to offer treatment before tragedy strikes? The pain felt by the surviving daughter, who witnessed her brother's death and barely escaped her own life, is unimaginable. She has, according to sources, been receiving therapy and will continue to do so in the months and years ahead. There is no timeline for healing after such trauma. The road will be long, but with time and the support of her extended family and community, she may find a way forward. The broader community of Branford, meanwhile, is still reeling. Though time has passed, the scar remains. Neighbors and family members continue to seek closure, but that will not come easily. In small towns like Branford, everyone knows everyone. The tragedy has left a lasting mark on the town's identity, its sense of security, and its belief that such horrors are reserved for other places. As for the legacy of Anthony Esposito Jr. and his children, it is now being shaped by the questions that will surround their story for years to come. What led him to this breaking point? Was it possible to intervene before it was too late? And can anything be done to prevent a similar tragedy from happening again? In the end, there are no easy answers. Legal battles will unfold, and healing will be a slow, private process for those who have lost the most. But the case will undoubtedly leave its mark on Connecticut's legal and mental health systems, sparking discussions about how we handle mental illness, family dynamics, and parental rights. And for the young girl who remains, the question of how she moves forward will remain personal and private. But there is hope, not in the form of answers, but in resilience. Story 2. August 6, 2023, an ordinary day that would soon be marked by a tragedy that no one saw coming. In the quiet suburban town of Raleigh, North Carolina, a family's life was torn apart in a way that would forever haunt their memories. On that day, Christopher McCullough, a man whose past had been marred by violence and instability, unleashed a brutal act that would leave an indelible scar on his family and his community. Christopher McCullough was a man with a troubled history, battling addiction, criminal charges, and a strained relationship with his wife, Mary. Despite his efforts to maintain a semblance of normalcy, cracks in his life were becoming harder to ignore. His marriage to Mary had become increasingly strained, overshadowed by years of abuse, both physical and emotional. Mary, who had once believed in her husband's potential for change, now found herself caught in a dangerous cycle of fear and uncertainty. But nothing could have prepared her for the unimaginable horror that would unfold that day. At the heart of this devastating moment was their young child, a 5-year-old boy who would be forced to bear witness to an act of violence that no child should ever experience. It is difficult to comprehend the terror that filled that room, one of helplessness, confusion, and a haunting realization that life would never be the same again. The child, too young to fully understand the weight of the events unfolding before him, would carry the burden of those memories for the rest of his life. The horrific attack that day left Mary McCullough dead, her life violently stolen from her. And yet, for those who knew her, the true tragedy was not just the loss of a mother and a wife, but the fact that her final moments were marked by a senseless and vicious act that could have been prevented. Christopher's actions, driven by rage and the demons that had plagued him for years, set off a chain of events that would lead to a trial that captivated the nation. This was not a simple case of a broken family. This was a culmination of years of trauma, neglect, and abuse. The crime and the aftermath raised troubling questions about the lengths a family can go to in order to escape their past, and whether those who cause such destruction can ever truly be held accountable for the lives they ruin. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this case was not just about a man accused of murder. It was about a system that failed, about a child whose innocence was stolen, and about a woman who never had the chance to break free from a man who had promised to love her. The trial would soon reveal a shocking truth, but the journey to justice would be far from easy. Today, we examine the story of Christopher McCullough, a man who, despite all the chances for redemption, chose violence instead. We will look at the path that led him to that fateful day, the devastating consequences that followed, an emotional toll that this crime has had on the surviving family members. This is a story of family fracture beyond repair, a story of love, betrayal, and ultimately, the quest for justice. To understand the full weight of the tragedy that unfolded on August 6, 2023, we must first take a look at the history of the McCullough family. Christopher McCullough, born in the early 1980s, was no stranger to hardship. Adopted as an infant, he entered a home that, from the very beginning, was full of challenges. Raised by parents who struggled with their own difficulties, Christopher grew up in an environment where love and stability were in short supply. By all accounts, his early years were filled with instability. As a child, he had trouble connecting with others, and his behavior became more erratic as he entered adolescence. It wasn't long before Christopher's troubles began to escalate. Known for his rebellious streak and his increasing resistance to authority, he began to find solace in destructive habits. His life took a dark turn when he started experimenting with drugs, which only worsened his already fragile mental state. Despite his struggles, Christopher eventually found a sense of purpose when he met Mary. She, too, had come from a troubled background, but she held on to a belief that love could heal all wounds. She was drawn to Christopher's vulnerability, believing that he could overcome his past. The two eventually married, and together they had a child. For a brief time, it seemed as though they might have a future together, a chance for both to break free from the demons that haunted them. But the darkness that had always been a part of Christopher's life could never truly be left behind. As the years went by, his temper grew more volatile, and the tension between him and Mary became harder to ignore. Their marriage was fraught with allegations of verbal and physical abuse. Christopher's substance abuse spiraled further out of control, and Mary found herself living in constant fear. In 2020, Mary filed for a domestic violence protective order against Christopher, a sign that the relationship had reached its breaking point. This protective order was a desperate plea for safety. But it wasn't enough. Christopher's history of violent outbursts only worsened in the following years, and his struggles with drugs made him unpredictable, dangerous even. Despite this, Mary chose to stay, hoping that Christopher would change. She tried everything she could to make their family work, but each effort was met with more violence, more heartache. The physical and emotional toll was taking its toll on her, but still, she believed that he could be the man she once loved. Sadly, this misplaced hope would prove to be the ultimate mistake. And so, by the summer of 2023, the situation had reached a breaking point. Mary had finally made the decision to separate from Christopher. She had reached out to family and friends, and she was preparing to escape the cycle of abuse that had defined her life for so long. But she wasn't given the chance to escape. On the morning of August 6, 2023, Mary's decision to break free would set in motion a sequence of events that would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. The pain of a lifetime of abuse, combined with Christopher's unchecked rage, would come crashing down with devastating force, and in one horrifying moment, the family's fragile hope for a new beginning would be violently shattered. August 6, 2023, started like any other day for the McCullough family. though for those who knew the truth of their household, the calm before the storm was only an illusion. Mary McCullough had made the difficult decision to end her marriage to Christopher. She had endured years of abuse, physical and emotional, and had finally reached her breaking point. She was ready to leave, to protect herself and her son. But for Christopher, this was the beginning of something far darker. The day began with a confrontation between the couple, a confrontation that quickly escalated. What started as an argument turned into a violent clash, one where Christopher's temper was no longer just a threat, but terrifying reality. Reports from that day suggest that, as tensions mounted, Christopher attacked Mary in their own home, a place that should have been her sanctuary. In an instant, it became a battleground, a place where fear replaced any sense of safety. Christopher, consumed by rage, lashed out at his wife with brutality that no one could have expected. Witnesses would later testify that the sounds of struggle echoed through the house, a chilling reminder that in the heat of that moment, everything Mary had worked for, her future, her hopes for a life free from violence, was slipping away. She fought back, but she was no match for the strength of a man who had been holding on to his anger for far too long. Their young son, just 5 years old, was caught in the middle. He had no understanding of what was happening around him. What he saw that day, what he experienced, would haunt him for the rest of his life. The child, trembling in fear, had nowhere to turn as his mother was viciously attacked before his very eyes. Christopher didn't stop. His rage seemed to have no boundaries. He continued to assault Mary, each blow sending shockwaves through the house, through their lives. Mary, though brave, was no longer able to defend herself. And in that moment, the unthinkable happened. She collapsed. What should have been a moment of escape, a chance to run, was turned into the final moments of her life. It wasn't until later that authorities would piece together the full extent of the violence that had taken place. The evidence left behind painted a horrifying picture of what had transpired in that home. Mary McCullough, a woman who had endured so much, was dead, her life stolen in a brutal, senseless act. For Christopher McCullough, it was a culmination of years of unchecked rage, addiction, and a marriage that had spiraled out of control. For their son, it was the loss of a mother, the destruction of family, and the burden of memory that would never fade. The child, still in shock, managed to flee the scene, running to a neighbor's house for help. The police arrived shortly thereafter, finding Mary's body and the wreckage of what had been a family's life. Christopher, in a state of confusion and anger, was arrested at the scene. The crime that had been committed was chilling in its brutality. A life lost, a family shattered, and a young boy left to pick up the pieces. But the true horror that day lay not only in what Christopher did to Mary, but in the reality that this act of violence was not an isolated incident. It was a tragic culmination of a series of events, choices, and warnings that had been ignored for far too long. What happened in that house on August 6, 2023, was not just a result of a single moment of rage, but a long history of abuse, addiction, and a family fractured by violence. The days that followed Christopher McCullough's arrest were filled with questions, confusion, and anticipation. What had driven a man to commit such a horrific act against his wife? And how would the justice system respond? As the weeks turned into months, the case began to take shape. And soon, Christopher McCullough would face the court, not just for the murder of his wife, but for the destruction of his family, the trauma inflicted on his child, and the devastating aftermath of his actions. Christopher's trial, which would take place later that year, would be one of the most emotionally charged proceedings in recent memory. The courtroom was filled with grief-stricken family members, supporters of Mary McCullough, and a public desperate for answers. But even as the trial began, one thing was clear. This would not be a simple case. The defense had already signaled that they would argue Christopher's mental state and substance abuse as mitigating factors. From the very beginning, it became apparent that the defense would try to paint Christopher as a man who was out of control, not only because of his anger, but because of his addictions. They argued that, on the day of the crime, Christopher was under the influence of both drugs and alcohol, suggesting that his actions were not fully intentional. His lawyers contended that he had been a man consumed by his demons, driven by substance abuse and mental illness that he could not control. But the prosecution's case was a stark contrast. They painted a chilling portrait of Christopher McCullough, not as a man driven to madness by addiction, but as someone who had been a ticking time bomb for years. They argued that the crime he committed was not a sudden act of rage, but the culmination of years of abuse and neglect and the explosive nature of his violent tendencies. They painted Christopher as a man who had taken advantage of every second he could, manipulating and abusing his wife, and in one final act, taking her life. The prosecution's evidence was damning. Witnesses were called to the stand to testify about Christopher's history of abuse. Mary's family, who had long suspected that something terrible might happen, shared their heartbreaking accounts of the years leading up to that tragic day. They spoke of the warning signs, of the bruises, the emotional scars, the countless pleas for help that had been ignored. They painted a picture of a woman who had tried and tried again to protect herself and her child, but who had found herself trapped in a cycle of violence that ultimately led to her death. One of the most painful moments in the trial came when Mary's sister, through tears, described the phone call she received just days before Mary's death. It was a call where Mary, trembling, confided in her sister that she was scared of Christopher, that she feared he would kill her. The words echoed in the courtroom, a devastating reminder of how close Mary had come to escaping the horrors of her marriage. But she never got the chance. In contrast, the defense's case seemed to try and soften a man they knew as Christopher McCullough. His attorneys called family members to the stand who described him as a loving father and husband when he wasn't under the influence. They suggested that his substance abuse had clouded his judgment, making it impossible for him to recognize the gravity of his actions. They argued that the crime was an outburst, an accident of sorts, a tragic moment that could have been avoided had he been sober. The emotional toll on the witnesses was visible. Mary's son, just 5 years old at the time of the murder, had to testify about the horrors he had witnessed. Though too young to fully understand what he had seen, his testimony brought the case into sharp focus. His recounting of the moment he saw his mother being attacked, of the terror in his eyes as he tried to escape, was heart-wrenching. The child's innocence had been shattered in an instant, his life forever altered by the violent actions of his father. As the trial continued, the courtroom became a battleground for justice. On one side, the prosecution demanded accountability for a life lost, for a child traumatized, and for a community devastated by the ripple effects of this violent act. On the other side, the defense continued to argue that Christopher had acted in a state of mental instability, driven by forces beyond his control. In the midst of this battle, the truth seemed to lie somewhere in between. Yes, Christopher was a man who had struggled with addiction and mental illness, but he was also a man who, at every turn, had chosen violence. His actions, regardless of his state of mind, had consequences. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Outside the courtroom, the McCullough family waited, their lives on hold as they desperately hoped for justice. For Mary's family, this trial was not just a legal proceeding. It was a final step in a long, painful process of coming to terms with the loss of someone they loved dearly. The question on everyone's mind was simple. Would Christopher McCullough be held accountable for his actions, or would his history of addiction and mental illness be enough to justify what he had done? Finally, after days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom held its breath as the judge called for the decision. Christopher McCullough was found guilty of first-degree murder, among other charges. The news was met with mixed emotions. For Mary's family, it was a painful victory, a sense that justice had been served, but that it could never fully make up for the loss they had endured. For Christopher, it was the end of any hope for redemption. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a fate that would keep him behind bars for the rest of his days. While conviction brought some semblance of closure, it could never erase the trauma that had been inflicted. The impact of the trial would resonate far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Christopher's son, who had been forced to testify, would carry the weight of his father's actions for the rest of his life. The scars, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal. The family of Mary McCullough would forever live with a painful reminder of what was lost: a mother, a sister, a daughter, a woman who had never had the chance to escape her abuser. The aftermath of Christopher McCullough's actions left a trail of devastation that would be felt long after the trial ended. For Mary's family, the grief was overwhelming. No amount of justice could bring her back. No sentence could undo the years of abuse that had culminated in her tragic death. But even as the legal battle came to a close, the emotional and psychological toll of the crime lingered, a dark shadow that would follow everyone involved. For Mary's son, the scars were not just physical but psychological. A young child, thrust into a world of pain and confusion, forced to grow up far too quickly. His memories of his mother were forever tainted by the violence he had witnessed. The fear that gripped him that day, the terror he felt as his world collapsed, would stay with him for the rest of his life. And though he was spared the full understanding of what had occurred, the trauma of witnessing his mother's murder would follow him into adulthood. The psychological effects on children who witness domestic violence are profound, and Mary's son would now have to face the difficult journey of healing from the unimaginable. For Mary's family, the pain was equally unbearable. Her sister, her parents, and all those who had loved her were left to grapple with the loss of a woman who had been full of life, full of promise. Mary had been a devoted mother, a caring daughter, and a sister who had done anything to protect those she loved. But in the end, it was her own safety that had been taken from her. The ripple effect of her death would be felt for years to come, as those closest to her struggled to make sense of her loss and find a way to move forward. And for the community of Raleigh, the murder was a wake-up call. Domestic violence, though often hidden behind closed doors, had always been present in their midst. Mary's death served as a painful reminder of the dangers that lurk in abusive relationships, of how quickly a life can be destroyed by one person's unchecked rage. It was a reminder that domestic violence affects not just the victims, but entire communities, leaving a lasting legacy of trauma and fear. In the wake of the crime, there was a renewed focus on the issue of domestic violence. Advocacy groups rallied around Mary's memory, using her story to raise awareness and push for greater protections for victims. Her case became one of many that highlighted the need for stronger intervention measures, both legal and societal, when it comes to preventing domestic violence. Calls for more resources for families in crisis, better mental health support for those struggling with addiction, and more comprehensive training for law enforcement to handle domestic abuse cases became central to the conversation. But for all the discussions and reforms, the simple truth remained. No amount of awareness, no number of new policies could change the fact that a woman was dead, a child was scarred, and a family was broken. Mary McCullough's death was not just a headline. It was a tragedy that exposed the darker side of domestic relationships, one that many, unfortunately, could relate to. It was a painful reminder of how easy it is for someone to slip through the cracks of a broken system, leaving victims in its wake. In the month that followed, Mary's family continued to fight for justice, but their grief never truly subsided. They became outspoken advocates for those suffering in silence, pushing to ensure that Mary's story wasn't just a sad chapter in a true crime documentary, but a call to action. The fight for justice, however, was not just about holding Christopher McCullough accountable. It was about preventing future tragedies, about protecting those who feel voiceless, and about ending the cycle of abuse that so often goes unnoticed. As for Christopher McCullough, his life behind bars would serve as a constant reminder of the consequences of unchecked violence. His actions, fueled by anger and addiction, destroyed a family and shattered the lives of everyone who had ever known Mary. But in the cold, dark walls of prison cell, Christopher's fate was sealed. There was no redemption, no escape from the weight of his choices. And as he spent his days serving his sentence, the real tragedy continued to unfold outside the prison gates. A child who would never truly know his mother, a family forever scarred by the violence of one man, and a community that would forever bear the mark of Mary McCullough's death. In the end, the true cause of this tragedy wasn't just the loss of one life. It was a destruction of everything that was built on a foundation of love and hope. What was meant to be a family had become a nightmare, a cautionary tale that should never have been written. Mary McCullough's story is one of loss, but it is also one of resilience. Her memory lives on in the fight against domestic violence, in the lives of those who continue to speak out, and in the strength of her family, who refuse to let her death be in vain. There are stories that stay with us, not because they're filled with shocking twists or courtroom theatrics, but because they reveal truths we often try to ignore. The story of Mary McCullough is one of those. It's not just the story of a murder. It's the story of a woman who tried to survive. A woman who, in the face of fear and violence, Still hope for something better. It's the story of a child forced to witness what no child should ever see. And it's the story of what happens when cries for help go unheard for too long. Mary did everything she could to protect her son, to break free from the violence that had haunted her home. She filed for separation. She made plans to leave. But in the end, it wasn't enough. Her life was stolen before she ever had the chance to start again. And for those who knew her, for those who loved her, there is no forgetting the pain of that loss. This case reminds us that domestic violence isn't always loud. It doesn't always announce itself with bruises or screams. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it hides behind closed doors, behind polite smiles and carefully chosen words. And by the time it surfaces, it can already be too late. Christopher McCullough will spend the rest of his life in prison. The justice system answered, but it came only after irreversible damage. Mary's son will grow up with memories no child should carry, and her family will continue to mourn her absence at birthdays, holidays, and all the ordinary days where her presence should still be felt. That is the real sentence, the one her loved ones now serve, day after day. But there is something we can do with stories like Mary's. We can listen, we can learn, and most importantly, we can act. We can choose not to turn away from signs of abuse. We can choose to believe those who come forward. And we can do our part to make sure that no one suffers in silence again. Mary McCullough's life was more than her final moments. She was a mother, a sister, a daughter, a friend. And though her life was taken far too soon, her story can still matter. Her name can still stand for something. Not just tragedy, but awareness. Not just loss, but change. Let her be remembered not just for how she died, but for who she was, and for the lives that may be saved because her story was finally told. Story 3. It was supposed to be a quiet Monday evening. The kind of night when children should be settling in after dinner, when the air feels calm and the day starts winding down. But inside a modest home in Oregon, that calm shattered like glass. At 8:26 p.m., a 911 dispatcher picked up the line. On the other end was a child, a 10-year-old girl, breathless, focused. Her voice was thin but unwavering. She said her mother had been hurt, badly. She said her siblings were nearby, and she said her father had run. The dispatcher tried to keep her talking, tried to keep her calm. But what this girl had just witnessed, what she had just done, would change everything. Minutes earlier, her home had turned into a scene of violence. The man who had once tucked her in at night, the one she had called Dad her whole life, had turned on the family with terrifying speed. There was shouting, then blood. Her mother attacked in front of them all. What most 10-year-olds would have done in that moment is freeze, run, hide. But she didn't do any of those things. She stepped between life and death. She fought back. She grabbed a knife. She screamed. She defended her family. Then she got her siblings out, made sure they were safe, and called for help. She didn't just survive the horror. She faced it. That phone call, made by a child soaked in courage, would trigger a citywide response. Police raced to the home. Paramedics swarmed in, and an entire community would soon learn the story of a young girl who refused to let her family be destroyed. In the days to come, authorities would praise her. Prosecutors would speak of her bravery in ways they rarely speak about children. But on that night, she wasn't thinking about being brave. She was just trying to save her mother's life. This is the story of a family almost torn apart, and of the little girl who held them together. Before the flashing lights, before the crime scene tape, before the headlines and the courtroom, there was a family, a mother, a father, and 3 children. Their home was tucked into a quiet Oregon neighborhood, where the streets were lined with modest houses and trim lawns, where neighbors passed each other with nods and polite hellos, and where kids rode their bikes down the sidewalk without needing to look over their shoulders. Inside that home, life looked like it does for so many others. The children shared rooms, argued over who got the last cookie, raced each other to the front door when their mom came back from the store. Their mother, by every account, was a steady presence, the provider, the nurturer, the one who held things together. She worked long hours, still made time for school events, and made sure birthdays were never forgotten. She gave her children what she could, not just food and clothes and shelter, but love, comfort, familiarity, the warmth of routine. Their father, Jesus Yukonantirian, was a different presence. Sometimes there, sometimes not, sometimes involved, sometimes distant. When he was around, the children knew to stay quiet when his voice got louder. They knew when tension hung in the room. Adults might call it walking on eggshells. Children don't have those words. They just know when to stay out of the way. There were good days, enough of them to make things feel normal, or close to it. The kids went to school. The mother worked. Groceries were bought. Bills were paid. And yet there were moments, fractures in the rhythm of everyday life, moments when arguments escalated, when voices were raised, when the children heard things they didn't fully understand but felt anyway. There is a silence that settles over a household when fear becomes familiar. And for this family, that silence had grown deeper over time. But still they endured. That mother kept going. She shielded her kids. She showed up. She endured the unease, the volatility, the uncertainty for them. She hoped things would stay manageable, that one day things might change. She never could have imagined how wrong she would be, and how close she and her children would come to never seeing another day together. The day started like any other. There was nothing about June 7th, 2021, that marked it for tragedy. The children had spent the day at home. They played. They argued. They asked for snacks. Their mother, tired as always, had done her best to keep things steady. A familiar kind of chaos. The usual noise of a house with 3 kids under one roof. It was summer. The air was still warm. The sky outside their window hadn't gone fully dark yet. And then the front door opened. Their father had returned. Jesus Yukonantirian walked in, and something was different. The children felt it instantly. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a shout. It was a shift in the air. His voice was sharp, his body tense. The mother's expression changed. She met his tone with her own, weary and edged with frustration. Words turned quickly, from accusations to shouting, from shouting to threats. And then the break. He went to the kitchen. He picked up a knife. The children were watching, all 3 of them. There was nowhere to hide from it. The mother stood in the doorway, trying to calm him. But this was no longer a conversation, no longer an argument. It happened fast. In one motion, he moved toward her and cut. The blade slashed across her neck. She fell. The room erupted in screams. The youngest children froze in place, paralyzed by a fear no child should ever feel. But the oldest, the 10-year-old daughter, moved. She didn't run away. She didn't back down. In that moment, she made a decision. She would not let her mother die. She would not let her siblings be hurt. She lunged toward the counter. Her hands fumbled past the dish rack, past the spoons, past the forks, and she found a knife. A child's hand wrapped around a weapon she had no training to use. But her instinct wasn't hesitation. It was defense. She raised it. She screamed at him to stop. Her voice, still young, still high-pitched, cut through the chaos like a siren. She charged at her father. She tried to stab him. He turned and fled, not out of confusion, not out of guilt, but because now there was resistance. And he hadn't expected it to come from his own daughter. He ran, out the door, into the night. The girl didn't wait. She helped her siblings get out of the house. Her mother was still alive, bleeding heavily, but conscious. The child picked up the phone. She dialed 911. She gave the address, told them her father had hurt her mother. She kept her voice together, even as her hands were shaking, even as the blood was still on the floor. He cut her throat, she told the dispatcher. He ran away. Please, please come. Those words would be repeated later in court. They would be written in police reports. They would become part of a story that people would struggle to believe, that a child had done all this. When first responders arrived, they were met with a scene no training could fully prepare them for. A mother clutching her neck, gasping for breath. two small children sobbing in the corner, and a 10-year-old girl standing guard. The kitchen was stained. The air was filled with panic and adrenaline. Paramedics rushed in. Police began to gather statements. The mother was immediately transported to the hospital. The children were taken into protective care. Officers searched the neighborhood for Jesus Hukanintirian, but he was gone. No one knew how far he had gotten. No one knew if he would come back. But in the hours that followed, one thing became unmistakably clear. That young girl had saved her family. If she had not acted when she did, if she had not stepped between her father and her mother, if she had not had the presence of mind to call 911, this story would have ended differently. The headlines would have been about a murder, about 3 children left without a mother. But that's not what happened, because that child, in the most terrifying moment of her life, refused to let fear make her powerless. And in doing so, she became the reason her mother lived. In the hours after the attack, the home that had once been filled with laughter and ordinary noise was silent. A crime scene, yellow tape cordoned off the front entrance. Investigators moved carefully from room to room, documenting the trail of violence left behind. But the most pressing concern was the mother. She had been stabilized and transported to the hospital. Her throat had been cut deeply. The wound was severe. Doctors would later say it was a matter of minutes. Any longer without help, and the outcome could have been fatal. Her survival was due to 2 things: medical response and her daughter. While she underwent emergency care, her children were kept in protective custody. They were interviewed separately. What they told detectives aligned. Their father had come into the house angry. There had been an argument. He picked up a knife. He cut their mother's throat in front of them. The oldest daughter had tried to stop him. She was calm, clear, direct. Her description of a sequence of events was so precise that law enforcement quickly classified her as both a witness and a victim. And now, they had to find the man responsible. Jesus Hukanintirian had vanished on foot. He had no known vehicle. Police canvassed the area. Patrol units were deployed. But he wasn't found that night. In the days that followed, the search expanded. Detectives contacted his known associates. His phone had been turned off. His social media activity stopped. It became clear he was deliberately evading capture. A warrant was issued. His name was added to regional and national law enforcement databases. But weeks passed, then months. No sightings, no credible leads. And as time moved on, the urgency remained, but the trail went cold. The mother recovered slowly. She had survived a near-fatal wound. But recovery was not just physical. Her children had witnessed the most traumatic night of their lives. And the man who had caused it was still free. Law enforcement never closed the case. The district attorney's office stayed in contact with the family. Then, nearly 3 years later, came the break. In March 2024, Jesus Hukanintirian was located in California. He had been living under the radar, avoiding contact with anyone who might lead police to him. U.S. Marshals, working with local authorities, executed the arrest. He was taken into custody without incident. Authorities transported him back to Oregon, where he was formally charged. Second-degree assault, constituting domestic violence. Some may have expected a more severe charge, but prosecutors chose what they believed would lead to a secure conviction, based on the available evidence, the testimony of witnesses, and the time that had passed. The focus was accountability. In court documents, the district attorney's office made it clear the case would not have made it this far if not for the testimony and actions of the 10-year-old girl. The same girl who had grabbed a knife, who had saved her siblings, who had called 911. At the time of his plea, Jesus Hukanintirian showed no visible emotion, no public statement. The sentencing was scheduled for April 28, 2025, and the court, for the first time, would formally recognize the magnitude of what that child had done. But for the family, closure isn't tied to a prison sentence. It's tied to healing. And for a mother and 3 children, healing began the night one of them chose to stand up when it would have been easier to hide. As the case moved through the legal system, it was no longer just a story of violence. It became a story of survival. A story that forced the justice system to grapple with something rare. A child, barely 10 years old, who had stopped a homicide in progress. Prosecutors in Lane County, Oregon, took the case seriously from the beginning, but they also understood what they were up against. A father who had vanished for nearly 3 years, and a family left to recover from a trauma that never fully disappears. In interviews and court filings, the Lane County District Attorney's Office acknowledged what everyone involved already knew. The attack was premeditated, it was personal, and it could have ended in death. But they also recognized the legal complexities, the burden of proving intent, the limits of physical evidence after so much time had passed. So they charged Jesus Hukin with second-degree assault constituting domestic violence, a serious felony, a conviction that carries weight, and one that kept the door open for a longer sentence, given the context, the presence of minors, the life-threatening nature of the injury, the flight from prosecution. In the courtroom, the facts spoke for themselves. The attack wasn't speculation. The children saw it. Their statements never changed. And the medical records confirmed the brutality of what had been done. But even outside the courtroom, the story was resonating, not just because of the crime, but because of the child at the center of it. Law enforcement officials praised her. First responders who arrived on scene later admitted they had never witnessed anything like it. A young girl who stayed calm, fought back, saved lives, and then guided everyone through the aftermath. In interviews, sheriff's deputies said her actions were beyond courageous. One officer reportedly said, "That girl didn't just help her mom. She made sure her brother and sister were safe too. She took control when most adults wouldn't know what to do." Child protection advocates took notice as well. Across the state, the story sparked conversation about the intersection of domestic violence and children, how often kids are the unseen witnesses, and how rarely their voices are centered in legal cases. One expert from a child advocacy center stated, "This case reminds us how invisible kids can be when violence happens at home. We don't often hear what they saw, what they did, or what they lost. In this case, the child was impossible to ignore." Prosecutors credited her with saving her mother's life. And in public statements, they made sure that the justice system and the community recognized that. As the sentencing hearing approached, the DA's office prepared to present victim impact statements, not only from the mother, but also, possibly, from the children, not to recount the violence, but to explain what it meant to survive it, and how survival, for them, came not from adults, not from the system, but from one of their own, a sister, a daughter, a 10-year-old child who had every reason to freeze, but didn't. On April 28, 2025, inside a Lane County courtroom, Jesus Hukin stood before a judge. For the first time in nearly 4 years, he faced the legal consequences of what he'd done. The charges were clear. Second-degree assault constituting domestic violence. The facts had already been established. The attack on the mother, the children who witnessed it, and the daughter who intervened. But sentencing isn't just about evidence. It's about impact. That's why the court heard directly from the victim, the mother who had survived the unimaginable. She spoke about the night she nearly died, about the pain, the surgeries, the months of physical recovery that followed. But more than that, she spoke as a mother, about what it meant to see her children watch her bleed, about the guilt, the trauma, and the strength she saw in her daughter, the strength that had saved her life. Her words were raw, but she did not ask for vengeance. She asked for peace, for distance, for the chance to raise her children without fear. Her voice did not waver when she said, "He tried to take my life in front of my babies, but we're still here because of her." That her was seated just a few feet away, now 13 years old, taller, quieter, but still unmistakably the same girl who had stepped between life and death 3 years earlier. She didn't speak in court. She didn't need to. Her actions had already spoken louder than words. The judge addressed the courtroom. The sentence, 7 years in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the assault, the presence of minor children, and the defendant's attempt to evade justice. But no sentence could truly restore what had been taken. Time, safety, innocence. For the family, the legal process was only one part of the healing. What mattered more was that their lives were no longer in limbo, that the man who had caused so much harm was now being held accountable, and that they were free to move forward, together. In the weeks after sentencing, advocates for domestic violence survivors continued to reference the case, not because of the brutality, but because of the bravery. One counselor put it best: "This is a story that should never have happened. But since it did, we're lucky that little girl was there, because she didn't just save her mother, she saved her whole family." There are moments that divide a life in two, before and after. For that family, June 7th, 2021 was that moment, but their story didn't end there. It continued, in courtrooms, in hospitals, in therapy sessions, and slowly in birthdays, in school graduations, in laughter that returned, however quietly, to the home. The world will remember this story for the violence that took place, but they should remember something else, too. That courage doesn't always look like a headline. Sometimes it looks like a child who refuses to run, a child who stands up even when no one asks her to, a child who saves a life. And doesn't stop there. Story 4. On June 22nd, 2016, a young woman ran into the woods near a stretch of Highway 94 in Minnesota. She left behind no clear trail, no phone, no shoes, no answers. Her name was Shanna Boiteau. She was just 23 years old. In the hours that followed, police searched the area. Helicopters scanned the woods from above. Flyers were printed. Family members waited by the phone. But Shanna was gone. And for nearly 9 years, that silence never broke. Her story became one of hundreds. Young women who vanished without explanation, without witness, without a trace. For some, their names are quickly forgotten. But Shanna's family never stopped searching. Not after days. Not after months. Not after years. Shanna grew up in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. She had hopes, dreams, people who loved her deeply. She had moments of struggle, like many young people do. But she was always trying, always finding her way forward, even if that path sometimes felt uncertain. On the day she disappeared, she had been traveling with her boyfriend. They argued, and then, according to his account, she got out of the car and ran. She was last seen near St. Cloud, running barefoot along the side of the highway before slipping into the trees. That was the final image anyone had of her, alive. Over the years, leads were chased. Tips came in. Rumors spread. Every so often, someone claimed to have seen her. But nothing ever led to Shanna. Her case became quieter over time, like so many do. But for those closest to her, silence didn't mean acceptance. Her father, Cletus, maintained a public plea year after year, hoping someone, somewhere, might remember something. Then, in the spring of 2025, nearly 9 years after she vanished, a drought in the region caused water levels to fall. A property owner in Augusta, Minnesota, discovered human remains in a once-flooded area of land. The location was just miles from where Shanna was last seen. On April 29th, the remains were identified through dental records. The search was over, but the story was far from complete. What happened to Shanna Boiteau that day? Why did she run? Did someone follow her? Or was she simply lost and never found? Until now, there was no note, no clear evidence of foul play, no confession. Just the overwhelming silence that now feels heavier than ever. In this story, we will follow the path Shanna walked, from the life she lived before she disappeared, through the complicated investigation, and into the heartbreaking discovery that finally gave her family some form of truth. This is not a story of closure. This is a story of love, loss, and unanswered questions that still echo across the woods of central Minnesota. This is a story of Shanna Boiteau. Before her name appeared on missing person flyers, Shanna Boiteau was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She was born in 1993 and grew up in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, a place surrounded by woods, rivers, and the kind of quiet that often feels like safety. She was curious, independent, and full of energy. From a young age, She had a heart that felt deeply. That kind of heart doesn't come without its own weight. As she moved into her teenage years, life wasn't always easy. There were ups and downs, emotional, personal, and sometimes more than most people knew how to handle. But she never stopped trying. She wanted to figure things out. She wanted to find peace. Those who knew Shanna say she was a listener, someone who made you feel like you mattered when she spoke to you. She had this way of connecting with people, even strangers. She didn't judge easily. She understood struggle, and she recognized it in others. Her father, Cletus Boiteau, was one of her closest supports. Over the years, their relationship deepened, built on love, frustration, concern, and unwavering care. He watched her grow through difficult phases and always believed in the woman she was becoming. There were times when Shanna pulled away, times when she needed space. Like many young people searching for direction, she drifted in and out of routines, friendships, and jobs. But her family never stopped being her anchor. Shanna had dreams of getting her life on track. She had talked about school, about traveling, about new beginnings. In the months before she disappeared, she had started reconnecting more regularly with loved ones. There were signs of healing, signs that something steady might be around the corner. But life isn't always about clear moments or clean resolutions. Sometimes it's about timing, about things left unsaid, about being young and unsure of what's next. In June of 2016, Shanna was in a relationship. It wasn't perfect. It had tension, moments of instability, and according to some, it wasn't always healthy. But it was part of her life at the time. And it was with that boyfriend that she began what would be her final known journey. They left Wisconsin and headed west toward California. Why they were going there or what they hoped to find remains unclear. Along that trip, something changed. Whether it was an argument, a moment of panic, or something deeper, we still don't fully understand. But what we do know is that Shanna never made it to her destination. And within days, she became a missing person. June 22nd, 2016. It was late afternoon. Temperatures were warm. The sky above St. Cloud, Minnesota, was mostly clear. Somewhere along Interstate 94, between mile markers and exits rarely noticed by passing drivers, Shanna Boiteau stepped out of a car and ran. According to her boyfriend, they had been arguing. The details of that argument remain vague, publicly unconfirmed. What is known is that she exited the vehicle suddenly, without her belongings. No shoes, no purse, no phone. She ran toward the tree line, near the freeway shoulder. It wasn't a residential area. There were no stores nearby, no sidewalks, just open road, scattered grass, and dense, wild woods on both sides. A witness later told police they had seen a young woman, barefoot, running into the trees. And then nothing. Police were called. They arrived at the location within minutes. A search was initiated almost immediately. Officers swept the woods. Dogs were brought in. A helicopter scanned from above. But it was as if the forest had swallowed her whole. No one found a trail. No sign of where she'd gone. Her scent disappeared quickly. And with no cell phone to ping, no shoes to leave a footprint, and no witnesses beyond that one passing motorist, the trail went cold before it ever had a chance to warm. In the hours that followed, Shanna's name was entered into local missing person databases. By the next morning, her photo began circulating online. Her family, hundreds of miles away, was devastated. Cletus, her father, drove to Minnesota as soon as he could, desperate to search, to talk to police, to find something, anything, that might explain where his daughter had gone. Over the next several days, searches expanded. Volunteers combed through the forest on foot. Drones were used. Still, nothing surfaced. No clothing. No footprints. No trace of movement beyond that one terrifying moment on the highway. People began asking questions. Why did she run? What was she afraid of? Had something happened in the car that day she couldn't explain? Or was she experiencing something internal? An episode of fear, confusion, or disorientation? The answers never came. And the longer they remained out of reach, the more speculation began to fill in the silence. But her father held on to hope. He believed Shanna might have survived that night, that she had gotten lost. that maybe she was out there, alive but unsure how to find her way back. He refused to let her name disappear. He kept calling authorities, kept organizing awareness posts, kept searching. For weeks, then for months, then for years. The day Shanna disappeared never stopped repeating itself in the minds of those who loved her. A single moment, a decision, a step into the trees, led to nearly a decade of questions. And for almost 9 years, no one knew what became of Shanna Boiteau after she ran barefoot into the woods along Interstate 94. When someone goes missing, time becomes both an enemy and a weight. Every hour that passes without a lead feels heavier than the last. For Shanna Boiteau's family, that weight settled in almost immediately. Within the first 48 hours of her disappearance, local police conducted a preliminary search of the area where she was last seen. The location was rural, thick with brush and tree cover, bordered by swamp-like terrain and stretches of forest that easily disguise movement or silence it completely. They canvassed the highway. They looked for surveillance footage, but there were no nearby businesses. No traffic cameras pointed toward the trees. No one else came forward to say they saw her after she left the road. The search perimeter was expanded. Officers used drones and helicopters to scan the area from above. Ground teams moved through fields and underbrush. But nothing was found. Not a single item linked directly to Shanna. No article of clothing, no piece of jewelry, not even a footprint. Very quickly, investigators had to consider a difficult truth. There were no signs of foul play, and there were no signs of survival. The forest offered no answers, only more questions. Back in Wisconsin, her family launched their own efforts. Cletus Boiteau, her father, became the driving force behind every public mention of her name. He worked with missing persons organizations. He made public appeals. He searched independently. He made maps, contacted reporters, pushed authorities to revisit evidence. His voice became the one constant presence in a case that kept falling deeper into silence. Over the years, tips would occasionally come in. Some claimed to have seen her in nearby towns. Others said she was traveling under a different name. One report described a woman matching her description, walking alone through a rest stop several hours south. Every lead was followed. None panned out. In 2017, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children included Shanna in their listings. Social media awareness campaigns were launched. Her case was profiled in blogs, local news segments, and missing persons forums. Her photo, always the same handful of images, was circulated repeatedly with the same plea underneath: if you've seen Shanna, please contact police. Meanwhile, her family faced their own emotional challenges. There was no memorial, no legal confirmation of death, no way to grieve properly because the possibility still existed that she was alive. That hope can be powerful, but it can also be tormenting. In 2019, Cletus gave an interview where he said, "We don't have a body. We don't have a trace. I can't give up on my daughter. If she's out there, she needs to know we're still looking." Investigators never officially closed the case, but activity slowed. Without new evidence, there was little they could do. No new witnesses, no new forensic material. And the terrain itself made any follow-up search feel like walking through a maze without walls. No direction, no trail to follow. One persistent question lingered. If Shanna was in distress that day, why didn't she try to return to the road? Why hadn't she flagged down a passing car? Was she trying to disappear? Or was she disoriented, lost in the wilderness, without the means to survive? There were theories. Some believed she may have succumbed to the elements, that she collapsed from dehydration, heat exhaustion, or injury. Others speculated about encounters with strangers in the woods, people who might not have come forward. And then there were those who wondered if the truth was far more complex, a mixture of mental health, impulsive decisions, and an environment that simply hit her too well. Still nothing surfaced. Year after year, the forest held its silence. The seasons changed. The flyers weathered and tore. Online interest faded, but Shanna's father never did. He continued pushing for updates. He continued traveling to Minnesota. And every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, he reminded the world that his daughter still hadn't come home. He never moved on, because for him, it wasn't over. Not until she was found. For nearly 9 years, Shanna Boiteau's name remained on missing person lists. For nearly 9 years, her family waited, caught between hope and heartbreak, clinging to the only thing they had left: time. Then, in early 2025, nature shifted. Minnesota experienced a period of unusually dry conditions. Droughts lowered water tables. Rivers and ponds receded. What was once hidden beneath murky shallows began to surface. And in the stillness of a quiet patch of land near Augusta, a discovery was made. A property owner, surveying dried-out terrain that had once been flooded, spotted something strange: fragments, weathered and aged, partially embedded in the earth. They called the authorities. At first, there was no indication that the remains were human. But as forensic investigators arrived and began examining the scene, it became clear this was someone's daughter, someone's story, someone who had been missing for a long time. The remains were skeletal. Time and exposure had stripped away detail, but dental records and forensic comparison would soon provide an answer. It didn't take long. On April 29, 2025, the Stearns County Sheriff's Office confirmed the remains belonged to Shanna Boiteau. After 3,139 days, the search had ended, but the grief, the confusion, remained. Shanna's body had been found just miles from where she was last seen, not in another state. Not far from a highway. She had been there all along, hidden by water, time, and silence. The location where she was found has not been publicly released. The sheriff's office has stated that there is still no indication of foul play. But for those who knew Shanna, that answer isn't enough. Not yet. For Cletus Boiteau, the confirmation brought a kind of closure, but not the kind anyone hopes for. He had spent nearly a decade calling her name into the void, never sure if it would echo back. Now he had an answer, but not the one he wanted. There would be no reunion, no phone call, no explanation from her lips, just the finality of loss. The permanence of remains returned to loved ones, and a story is still missing its ending. The questions haven't gone away. Why did Shanna run into the woods that day? What was she feeling? What was she fearing? Was she hurt? Was she lost? Was someone with her? And why, for so many years, did the ground hold on to her while the world moved on? Answers may never come. There was no note, no evidence left behind, just a space where her story ended and the aching quiet that surrounds it. In the end, the land gave her back, but it took nearly 9 years to do so. Shanna Boiteau was 22 years old when she vanished, just beginning adulthood, just starting to rebuild. A woman caught between trying to heal and try to escape what had hurt her. A daughter loved deeply, whose story was never supposed to end in silence. What happened in those woods that day may never be fully understood, but it wasn't the sum of who she was. Shanna was more than a missing person flyer, more than a case number, more than the final few minutes of a long car ride that ended too soon. She was someone who laughed with her whole face. Someone who asked questions that mattered. Someone who struggled, yes, but who also kept trying to find her way forward, even when the road ahead felt uncertain. When we talk about people who go missing, the conversation too often drifts toward theory. We become investigators in our minds, searching for patterns, speculating motives, chasing possible endings. But every case like Shanna's is more than mystery. It's memory. It's humanity. It's pain and love, and hope stretched across years by people who refused to forget. Her father never gave up. He carried her story when others stopped asking. And now, even in the sorrow finality, he carries her still. Because even though she's been found, this isn't closure in the way people imagine. There are no clear answers. No final chapter written in certainty. There's only the knowledge that her search is ended, and the responsibility, now, to remember her not as someone lost, but as someone loved. Her story is a reminder, not just of what can happen in a moment, but of what families endure when there's no resolution. It's a call to care, to listen, to act when people show signs of distress, to understand that disappearing doesn't always begin on the day someone vanishes. Sometimes it begins quietly long before. And so we remember Shanna Boiteau, not only for the tragedy of her disappearance, but for the years she lived, the people she touched, and the enduring love of a father who never let her name fade. Shanna's voice is no longer missing. It lives in every person who tells her story with care. It lives in every step forward taken by families still searching. It lives in memory. And memory, when carried with love, never disappears.